Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting these jellyfish. It's been requested for a while now and I've finally gotten around it. So let's begin by drawing it out into simpler shapes so it's a bit easier to paint later on. I'm going to begin by drawing out the shape of the bell or the hood of the jellyfish. This is the shape that I'm going to look for. It's more of like a mushroom shape. You can also make the sides kind of protrude outwards a bit more or even make it more open. The jellyfish is obviously very flexible and it can be distorted into all different types of shapes. So I'm going to paint using the shape on the left. This is a view from the bottom, so you can see an opening at the bottom, but you can also paint this from the top if you want, in which case you won't be able to see the opening at the bottom. And here I'm just going to show you the same shapes with the view from the top. If you want to explore a bit more positions or viewpoints for the jellyfish, you can try to explore more in this stage, so you can include it in your final composition. But since I know that I just want to paint using the simpler shape, I'm going to get right into the details now. Personally, I want to show the details of the tentacles for my painting, so I'll be drawing the details out in this angle. I'm only going to do a simple pattern for the top, which follows the cross contour lines for the hood. And this will also help depict the round form of the hood. And as for the bottom, I like to connect the sections with curved lines because I find that this will help make the shape look a bit softer and less stiff in my opinion. I also added another curved line underneath the hood as a second layer for the innards or something, but I find that this will help the jellyfish look more translucent for the painting. The most complex part of this drawing and painting are probably the arms. I like to first draw out more of a fluid shape where I'll play with the flow in the composition, and this will just represent the overall silhouette of the arms. Then once I've played with the flow, then I divide it up into sections where I'll be drawing fluid zigzag lines for the frills. I connect each zigzag lines upwards. Then I like to do around 3 main ones, then maybe additional ones to fill in the space if I need to. After I finish drawing out the basic folds, then I like to add the texture, which are the really soft frills at the bottom of where the zigzag pattern is, and I also add additional lines close together upwards to accentuate the shape a bit further. As the folds are going downwards and is folding inwards and outwards, you will notice that there are two sides to this. So I like to separate those two sides by making one of the sides a little bit darker and more textured compared to the other. And this is just to separate those sides to give a bit more definition to the form. Lastly, as for the tentacles, I like to make really long, flowy curved lines, and I try to space them apart by drawing them out in between the curved lines underneath the hood. That's pretty much it for the jellyfish, but I will draw a larger version of the arms just to make it a bit easier for you to see the details. You can practice this out separately if you still feel the need to visualize the folds because it can be quite tricky. So I'm just going to draw a couple more here as an example of how you can try to practice before painting it. As for the composition, personally, I like to do small thumbnail sketches, and I like to also simplify the shapes. So I would just draw the hood as well as the basic flow of the arms and tentacles, as well as the viewpoint of the jellyfish. So either from the bottom, the top, the sides, and things like that. I am going to incorporate 2 jellyfish for my composition, but you can also add smaller ones or maybe 3 evenly spaced ones for your composition as well. Just try to play around with your thumbnail sketches and see which composition you like best. If you feel uncomfortable or limited by drawing the frame out first, you can also draw the subject first, and once you like how it looks, then you can try to figure out how to frame it afterwards. You can keep practicing if you need to and draw as many thumbnail sketches until you find the right composition, but I'll just get right into the colors which I'll be using for this painting. I'll be using a very limited palette, and these are just the colors that I've chosen, but this is very flexible. You can choose any hue that you would like. So here I have Bleed Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. As for the colors, I have chosen Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, Cobalt Green by Holbein, and Prussian Blue by Holbein. Before I begin to paint, I did a very light outline of just the hood and where the tentacles are going to flow. This is so I can get them evenly spaced out, so I don't have to make guesses if I paint them freehand. I started out by dampening the surface of one of the hoods, and this also excludes the bottom portion where the tentacles are going to be. Instead, I just painted the very short curved lines freehand with my brush. And I'm going to leave the portion at the back completely empty so I can paint on the arms later on. In terms of the color, I want this to be mostly green or the cobalt green, so I first used the thin consistency of that on the damp surface, and then I added a little bit of Hansa Yellow Medium into the mixture just to make it a bit more green in certain areas. And I tried to place the colors randomly and just let them blend naturally from the damp surface, but in general I do want the top section of the hood to be slightly lighter compared to the bottom section. Once I'm done with the first hood of the jellyfish, I'm just going to let that dry. Meanwhile, I'm going to move on to the second one, and I'm treating this the same way by dampening the surface. I still use cobalt green as the base, but this time I added more Prussian blue for the darker areas at the bottom. You may see that the paint is reacting quite differently on this jellyfish. That's because I think the paper was quite damaged in that area, so it was behaving kind of weird and the paint didn't flow naturally. Hopefully your paper is not like this, so it should be a bit smoother. For the arms, as you can see, I just basically follow where I've drawn out the flow of the tentacles. For the base color, I used a medium consistency of Prussian blue mixed with cobalt green. And then I cleaned and dampened my brush and pulled the excess paint downwards while wiggling my brush lightly so the bottom is slightly lighter than the top. And I'm going to do the same thing with this second one. And while the surface is still damp, I also added a mix of the cobalt green with a little bit of Hansa Yellow. Because I want the second jellyfish to be a bit more blue and a little bit darker, I used more Prussian blue in the mix, and I used a bit more of that compared to the lighter consistency for the first jellyfish. For the layer inside of the hood, I decided to just paint it on freehand. So I just make a smaller version of the hood using a thin to medium consistency of cobalt green. And for the bottom section, because I want it to be a little bit darker, I added a tiny bit of Prussian blue, and I tried to also accentuate the curved lines. For the second jellyfish, I used a mixture of cobalt green with a little bit of Prussian blue, and I use a thin to medium consistency again. And as for the bottom portion of this second layer of the hood, I used more Prussian blue in the mix. Moving on to the more complex part of this painting, which are the arms. The base color should be completely dry by now, so what I'm painting should not blend with the base color. For this jellyfish, I use Prussian blue with a touch of cobalt green in a thin to medium consistency. Then I follow this up by using a mix of cobalt green with a touch of Hansa yellow for some of the arms at the bottom. And as I progress downwards, I want the zigzag lines to become lighter and less distinct. I'm going to do the same thing for this next jellyfish, but I use more cobalt green in the mix, a thicker consistency for the top and a thinner consistency for the bottom section. As you can see, some of the lines are quite abstract. Some might be thicker than the others and some might be disconnected. I tried to make this sort of random, but I'm still thinking of a little bit of form at the same time. For the outer pattern of the hood, I like to use a light consistency of cobalt green and draw lines following the cross contour of the hood, just as we practiced drawing earlier. Then I'm going to follow it up with bleed-proof white, or you can also use an opaque white gouache to paint on top of the lines. I like to play around with the lines by sometimes disconnecting the line or make some parts as dots or dashed lines. Some might also be thicker for a bit of variation. I also went on to paint the rest of the back part of the hood so it goes around the arms of the jellyfish. For the jellyfish on the left, I use cobalt green with a touch of Prussian blue to darken the color slightly. As for the jellyfish on the right, I use Prussian blue as is to paint the edges of the backside of the hood to define it further. After that, I'm going to continue painting the pattern on the hood of the blue jellyfish as well as the green jellyfish by using the same method, and I also layer on more colors for some parts to define the shapes further. At the bottom here, I extended some of my brush strokes upwards using a mix of cobalt green with a little bit of Prussian blue. I also used some of the white, and just like before, this will define the form even further. This is where I start getting into a bit more detail with arms of the jellyfish. If you remember from the drawing portion, I mentioned before that I want to separate the two sides, so one part should be darker, and I'm just imagining the shapes very roughly here. So I'm just coloring those areas while leaving some parts with the base color. After this, I'm going to follow it up with a medium to thick consistency of bleed-proof white, and this is to add on the frilly textures at the bottom and also some of the lines. For the lines, I made them much lighter because I don't want the lines to be too heavy. So I want the frills to be much lighter in comparison to the lines, which I tried to paint on very thinly using the tip of my brush. You can also use a smaller brush for this and a lighter consistency if you're scared of making the lines a bit too thick and heavy. I'm basically just drawing as I did with pencil earlier by following the zigzag lines, but this time I made the edges very wavy. And after I've done the top portion of it, as I get towards the bottom, I made the white a bit more transparent so it slowly disappears into the bottom area. And once the arm starts to get a bit more definition, I'm going to leave that to dry and paint on the tentacles. I switch to a liner brush for this to get really thin, delicate lines, and I use a thick consistency of the main color of the jellyfish. So for this case, I use a mixture of cobalt green with a little bit of Hansa yellow, and I'm using a very thick consistency with a light brush load, so the paint doesn't bleed off my brush. I like to make the top portion of the tentacles much thicker so it's more defined and you can see where it connects to the hood of the jellyfish, and I'm also going to do the same for the bottom tip of some of the tentacles. I'm going to do the same thing for the second jellyfish as well, and because this one is a bit more blue, I use mostly Prussian blue in the mix with a little bit of cobalt green, and I'm going to treat it the same way. I'm going to go over the arms again. I'm just going to paint a light consistency of the same color of the jellyfish, and this is just to define the sides and separate them further. I'm mostly done with the jellyfish here, so I'm just going to do final adjustments like increasing the value or contrast and vibrancy. I also want to add a bit more lines for the pattern on the hood, so I'm going to use a thinner consistency so it dries quite translucent. Here, I'm just going to layer on a darker value of the blue. This is again to separate the sides further, and I'm going to do the same for the second jellyfish. Lastly, I want to create the dust specks that you can usually see underwater. I'm not sure if that's dust, but it's something that reflects off the light. And I'm just going to do this by adding splatters using the main colors of the jellyfish very lightly. And I'm going to enlarge some areas manually with the brush, so some parts are a bit more defined. This is completely optional. I've had a couple of people who mentioned they don't like splatters. If that's the case, then just don't add them for your own painting, and you can stop whenever you feel like you're satisfied with the outcome of your painting. So that's pretty much it for the jellyfish. This is the finished painting. I'm pretty happy with how the textures and the colors came out. Of course, you can also experiment with different colors as well. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!